In February of 1899, the residents of a Colorado mining town tore the planks off their own houses, whittled them into 75 pairs of skis, and fled down the mountain in what they turned into a race. Entry fee, 1 ham sandwich. The town was called Independence, and it sat just up the pass from a place that would soon become the most expensive zip code in the American West. That place was Aspen. Today, a single-family home there has a median price north of $17 million, and in 2025, nearly 9 out of every $10 spent on Aspen real estate went toward houses that cost more than $20 million. The chefs who cook in its restaurants, the nurses who staff its hospital, the teachers in its schools, almost none of them can afford to live in the town they keep running. The same mountains that once produced 1/6 of the silver in the United States now produce something stranger, a resort so exclusive that the people who built its reputation have been steadily pushed out of it. This is a town that has boomed, collapsed into a near ghost town, and boomed again, twice, in a way almost no other place in America ever has. And the reason nobody can visit it anymore has almost nothing to do with the skiing. Long before any of that, before the first prospector ever crossed the pass, the valley belonged to the Ute. They called themselves the Nooch, and the band that hunted this stretch of the Roaring Fork went by the name Nooch, the Elk People. For centuries, they followed the game up into the high country every summer, camping in the meadows where Aspen now stands, then dropping back down toward the hot springs near present-day Glenwood for the winter. Tools and the remains of their temporary shelters have been found on both sides of Independence Pass, some of them thousands of years old. This was not empty land waiting to be discovered. It was somebody's home, and it had been for a very long time. What changed everything was a set of government surveys in the 1870s that mapped the western slope of Colorado and marked in careful notation where the minerals might be. Once that information existed, the outcome was close to inevitable. Prospectors carrying copies of the Hayden survey started slipping across the Continental Divide, staking claims on land that treaties had promised would stay Ute. When the Army pushed them off, they came right back. The pretext for removal arrived in the fall of 1879, about 100 miles to the north, at an Indian agency run by a reformer named Nathan Meeker. Meeker had been trying to force the White River Utes to give up hunting and become Christian farmers, and he had gone so far as to plow up a field the Utes used to race their horses. The confrontation turned violent. Meeker and 10 of his employees were killed, and a group of soldiers was ambushed nearby. The killings gave Colorado's political class exactly the opening they had wanted. Governor Frederick Pitkin, who would later have the county containing Aspen named after him, had campaigned on a slogan that left little room for interpretation. The Utes must go. In private, he put it even more starkly, writing that unless the government removed them, the Ute would have to be exterminated, and that the 12 million acres of land opened up by their departure would more than pay for the trouble. In 1881, roughly 1,450 Ute men, women, and children were force-marched under cavalry escort some 350 miles to a reservation in Utah, a place far drier and harsher than the mountains they had always known. The valley was now open for business. Pitkin County was organized that same year, and the town builders moved in almost before the dust of the removal had settled. The first real strike in the valley actually came at Independence, up near the top of the pass, on the 4th of July in 1879. A prospector hit a vein of gold. The date supplied the name, and within a couple of years, the camp had swelled to something like 1,500 people, with grocery stores, boarding houses, and saloons perched at nearly 11,000 feet. It produced around $190,000 in gold in a single good year. Then the shallow veins ran out. The figure dropped to a mere $2,000, and the miners started drifting 16 miles downhill to a camp in the valley where silver, not gold, was turning up in enormous quantities. That camp had begun life as Ute City, founded in 1879 by an early arrival named Henry Gillespie. In 1880, a surveyor and promoter named B. Clark Wheeler walked in, laid out a proper town plan, and renamed the place Aspen for the trees blanketing the slopes. Wheeler was working on behalf of a Cincinnati businessman named David Hyman, one of several outside money men who understood something the individual prospector often did not. The silver in these mountains was real, but getting it out and turning it into a fortune would take capital, railroads, and patience that a man with a pick and a mule simply did not have. For the first few years, Aspen grew slowly, and it grew despite serious obstacles. The ore was rich, some of the richest silver ever found anywhere on Earth. But the town sat on the wrong side of the Continental Divide, cut off from the smelters and markets of the Front Range by mountain passes that closed under snow for half the year. Hauling ore out by wagon over Independence Pass ate up the profit before it ever reached a buyer. Everything hinged on the railroad. The men who had bet on Aspen spent the mid-1880s waiting, and in 1887 the wait ended when the Denver and Rio Grande finally pushed its tracks into town. A second line, the Colorado Midland, arrived close behind. The effect was immediate and enormous. Ore that had been stranded could now move at industrial scale, and the money that had been trickling in became a flood. The population, which had been counted in the hundreds, shot past 5,000 and kept climbing. Aspen was about to become, for a brief and dazzling stretch, one of the richest places in America. The railroad did more than enrich Aspen. It killed the town's rivals, and there were several. When the prospectors first spread out from Leadville, Aspen was only one of 5 mining camps that sprang up in the Roaring Fork Valley, and for a while it was not even the biggest. 11 miles up Castle Creek sat a camp called Ashcroft, founded in 1880 by a man known around the diggings as Crazy Culver, who staked his claim where 2 forks of the creek came together and promoted it so hard that within 2 weeks the place had a courthouse, laid out streets, and the Miners Association. Ashcroft boomed faster than Aspen did. By 1883, it held somewhere around 2,000 people, with 2 newspapers, a school, a smelter, and roughly 20 saloons, and its early ore ran an astonishing 14,000 ounces of silver to the ton. That kind of yield pulled in the biggest name in Colorado silver, the Leadville millionaire Horace Tabor, who bought into the local mines, built himself a house with gold-flecked wallpaper, and reportedly bought a round of drinks in every saloon in town when he visited. For a couple of years, Ashcroft was larger than Aspen and closer to the railhead at Crested Butte, and it looked like the safer bet. Then the veins turned out to be shallow. The ore played out near the surface, and the decisive blow landed in 1887 when the Denver and Rio Grande ran its line into Aspen instead of up Castle Creek. The center of gravity shifted to the tracks overnight. Ashcroft's residents packed up and moved to Aspen, some of them literally dragging their cabins down the valley on skids. Of the 5 camps that started the race, only Aspen would survive the boom and bust cycle intact, and Ashcroft became one more ghost town in the hills above the winter. The mines on Aspen and Smuggler Mountains were the engine of all of it. The smuggler, the Molly Gibson, the Compromise, and their neighbors were tapping into deposits of almost freakish purity. At its peak, the smuggler alone was responsible for nearly 1/5 of the entire world's silver output, its tunnels eventually reaching more than 1,000 feet down and running underneath the town itself. The men who dug it out did dangerous, punishing work for a few dollars a day, drilling and blasting in wet tunnels far below the surface. and the smuggler kept more than 200 of them employed at the boom's height. Down in those lower levels, the mines flooded constantly, and the owners eventually had to import deep-sea divers to repair a broken pump more than 1,000 feet underground, an almost unthinkable thing to attempt in a landlocked mountain town. By 1891, Aspen had passed Leadville, the older and more famous camp to the east, to become the single largest silver-producing district in the United States. At its height, the valley was yielding something close to 1/6 of all the silver mined in the entire country. Over roughly 7 years, the Aspen mines produced $112 million in ore, a figure that in the currency of the day represented a concentration of wealth few American towns of any size could match. The men who owned the best claims became rich beyond anything their early years had prepared them for, and they began spending accordingly. The face of that spending was a New Yorker named Jerome B. Wheeler, no relation to the surveyor who had named the town. Jerome Wheeler had married into the Macy's department store family and served as the store's president, and he arrived in Aspen in the early 1880s with something the local mines badly needed, which was cash and the willingness to put it to work. He built a smelter at the foot of the mountains so the ore no longer had to leave the valley to be processed. He financed an electric tramway to move it. He poured money into the Colorado Midland Railroad, and having made the town's fortune more secure, he set about giving it the trappings of a real city. Aspen got electric streetlights, one of the first towns west of the Mississippi to have them, powered eventually by its own hydroelectric plant. In 1889, Wheeler opened 2 buildings that announced Aspen's arrival to the wider world. The first was the Wheeler Opera House, the 3rd largest in Colorado, a Victorian showpiece meant to bring touring companies and culture to a town barely a decade removed from tents. The second was the Hotel Jerome. The Jerome was Wheeler's attempt to build a hotel that could stand next to the great hotels of Europe, and by frontier standards he succeeded spectacularly. It had steam heat, electric lighting, indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water, and the first elevator anyone in Aspen had ever seen. Wheeler hired a French chef and served seafood shipped in from both coasts, an almost absurd luxury for a mining town 100 miles from the nearest city of any size. Getting the place built had nearly broken him even before the doors opened. He had loaned $60,000 to a pair of Kansas innkeepers to construct it, watched the costs more than double, and then discovered that the builders had vanished about a month before the opening, leaving him holding roughly $150,000 in bills. He finished it himself and threw a grand opening party on the eve of Thanksgiving in 1889. For a few years, the Jerome was the beating heart of a boomtown that seemed to have no ceiling. The wealthy of Aspen dined there in the latest fashions from back east, and the town around it swelled to more than 10,000 people, supporting 6 newspapers, several theaters, and a small district of dance halls and saloons. There was even brief, half-serious talk among local boosters of moving the state capital from Denver to Aspen. The town had gone from Ute hunting ground to one of the wealthiest cities in the Rockies in a little over a decade. None of it was as solid as it looked. The entire structure of Aspen's prosperity rested on a single, fragile fact, which was that the United States government was propping up the price of silver by buying enormous quantities of it. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 had roughly doubled those purchases, and it poured fuel on an already roaring fire, sending Aspen's production and population to their absolute peak in 1891 and 1892. Silver miners across the West understood on some level that their good fortune depended on a policy that could be reversed by a vote in Washington. Most of them chose not to think about it. When the reversal came, it came fast and it came hard. A financial panic swept the country in the spring of 1893. Banks began failing by the hundreds, and President Grover Cleveland called a special session of Congress to repeal the Sherman Act, which he blamed for draining the nation's gold reserves. The repeal went through in the fall. The government stopped buying, the artificial floor under silver prices vanished, and the metal that had built Aspen became, almost overnight, nearly worthless. The collapse of Aspen was as sudden as its rise had been. Mines that had employed hundreds of men shut down within weeks. The miners, with no work and no reason to stay, packed up and left for wherever they could find a paycheck. And the investors and speculators followed them out. Between the census of 1890 and the census of 1900, the town lost around 35% of its population, and the decline only deepened from there. A city that had held more than 10,000 people at its peak would eventually fall below 1,000. Jerome Wheeler, the man who had built the Opera House and the hotel and the smelter, was ruined along with the town. A tangle of lawsuits from mining investors who claimed he had cheated them combined with the crash to destroy nearly all of his wealth. He lost both the Hotel Jerome and the Wheeler Opera House to back taxes, unable to keep up with the payments. By 1903, he was declaring bankruptcy in a New York court, listing $500,000 in assets against $1.5 million in debts. The loss of the Opera House, his favorite of all his properties, was said to have grieved him the most. He had built the grandest hotel in the Rockies, and within a few years he could not have afforded a room in it. There is one detail from the wreckage that captures the whole absurd tragedy of Aspen's timing. In 1894, a year after the crash had already gutted the town, miners at the Smuggler cut into a single mass of nearly pure silver, so large it could not be brought up the shaft in one piece. They had to break it into 3 sections to remove it. Trimmed down for extraction, it weighed 1,840 pounds and assayed at around 96% pure silver, the largest silver nugget ever mined in the United States, and quite possibly the world. It was a discovery that a few years earlier would have made headlines and fortunes. Now it came out of the ground into a market where silver was barely worth digging for, a monument to wealth that had arrived precisely too late to matter. The mine's owner, David Hyman, could only watch the metal that should have crowned his career emerge into a world that no longer wanted it. The Smuggler was tough enough to survive where most Aspen mines died, limping along on the ore it could still pull profitably until it finally closed in 1918. But the boom was over, and what came after it was a silence that lasted for 2 generations. Aspen's residents took to calling the decades that followed the still years, and the phrase was almost too gentle for what they lived through. From the turn of the century until the end of the Second World War, Aspen was a near ghost town with beautiful bones. The Victorian mansions that Silver had built still stood, but many of them sat empty and rotting, their owners long gone. The Grand Opera House went dark, limped through a couple of decades of the occasional silent film and a rotating cast of owners, and was finally shut for good after a fire in 1912. The Hotel Jerome survived, but survival meant decline. It passed from Wheeler to a Denver businessman, then eventually to a former bartender named Mansour Elisha, a Syrian immigrant who had first stayed at the hotel as a traveling salesman and ended up buying it for little more than the back taxes owed on it. Under Elisha and his son, the Jerome became less a luxury hotel than a large, old-fashioned boarding house, the closest thing the shrunken town had to a living room. Through the Great Depression and the war years, room and board there ran about $10 a month, and a full dinner could be had for 50 cents. Many of Aspen's remaining prominent couples simply lived at the hotel for years at a stretch. Up the pass, Independence had it worse. because independence had nothing to fall back on at all. By 1890, most of its residents had already given up on the thin mountain air and the vanishing gold and moved down to Aspen. The ones who stayed were gambling that the mines had a little more life in them. The winter of 1899 called that bet. A record snowfall, remembered as one of the worst in the young state's history, buried the town and cut off every supply route into it. Food ran low, then ran out, and the remaining residents faced a simple and brutal choice between starving in place and finding a way down the mountain. They chose the mountain. They pried the boards off their own cabins, shaped roughly 75 pairs of crude skis, and made their escape down toward Aspen as a group, turning the evacuation into a downhill race with an entry fee of a single ham sandwich. By 1912, the last resident was gone, and Independence became what it remains today, a scatter of collapsing log cabins at the top of the pass, preserved now by the Aspen Historical Society and the Forest Service as a monument to how quickly a Colorado boomtown could die. The irony that the desperate people of Independence escaped their dying town on skis would take almost half a century to reveal itself. Because skiing in the end was what saved Aspen, though nobody living through those still decades could have predicted it. The first hint came in the 1930s, when a handful of enthusiasts recognized that the same steep, snow-loaded terrain that had tormented the miners was close to perfect for a sport still exotic in America. A Swiss avalanche expert named André Roche laid out an early run on Aspen Mountain in 1936, and a small ski club cut trails and rigged a crude lift powered by a mine hoist. The real turning point came with the war. The Army trained its 10th Mountain Division, its specialist alpine soldiers, at Camp Hale, not far away. And those men used the mountains around Aspen for exercises. One of them was an Austrian named Friedel Pfeiffer, who had grown up in the great ski town of St. Anton, and who looked at the decrepit old mining camp and saw, underneath the ruin, a European ski village waiting to be built. Pfeiffer came back after the war with empty pockets and a fixed idea, bought land at the base of the mountain, and started making plans to turn Aspen into something the American West had never really had. What Pfeiffer had in vision, he lacked in money, and the money arrived in 1945 in the person of a Chicago industrialist named Walter Pepke. Pepke ran the Container Corporation of America. He had a sophisticated eye shaped by his patronage of the Bauhaus design movement, and he had a wife, Elizabeth, who had fallen for Aspen on a skiing trip and urged him to see it. When Pepke came, he moved fast and he thought big. He bought up distressed property all over the town core, much of it for little more than the taxes owed, acquiring the dilapidated Hotel Jerome and Wheeler Opera House, along with a good share of Aspen's real estate. He teamed up with Pfeiffer to form the Aspen Skiing Corporation in 1946, and together they built what was then the longest chairlift in the world up the side of Aspen Mountain. But Pepke wanted something stranger and more ambitious than a ski resort. He had an idea he called the Aspen Idea, a vision of a place devoted to the whole human being, mind, body, and spirit, where business leaders and intellectuals and artists could ski in the morning and argue about philosophy in the afternoon. He built it out with startling speed. In 1949, Pepke staged a massive celebration of the 200th anniversary of the birth of the German writer Goethe, importing world-famous thinkers, including the physician and philosopher Albert Schweitzer, to a mountain town most of them had never heard of. That event became the seed of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, still one of the most influential gathering places for the powerful in the country. The same year, the Pepkes helped launch the Aspen Music Festival, which brought classical musicians and students to the valley every summer. 2 years after that, Walter founded the International Design Conference, drawing designers and architects from around the world. He brought in the Bauhaus master, Herbert Bayer, who spent years in Aspen restoring its Victorian buildings, designing new ones, and painting the Hotel Jerome with the pale blue and white color scheme people still recognize. Skiing gave Aspen an economy again. Culture gave it a reputation. And in 1950, the town hosted the World Downhill and Slalom Championships, the first held in the United States, announcing to the world that the old silver camp had been reborn as something entirely new. The mansions got their paint back. The Jerome filled up again. Aspen, against every reasonable expectation, had come back from the dead a second time. For a while, the reborn Aspen kept a foot in both worlds, glamorous and scruffy at the same time, and that tension produced the town's wildest chapter. Movie stars started arriving in the 1950s and never really stopped. The Kennedys came for a family retreat in the 1960s. Elvis dropped in for ski trips, and John Denver moved to the valley and wrote songs about the Rocky Mountains that pulled a whole generation of admirers toward Colorado. But alongside the celebrities came the counterculture, and its high priest was the writer Hunter S. Thompson, the inventor of gonzo journalism, who settled at a farm in nearby Woody Creek and made Aspen his battlefield. The first piece Thompson ever wrote for Rolling Stone was about the town, and it carried the title, The Battle of Aspen. That battle was already underway. Thompson had watched the ski money and the real estate money pour into the valley and conclude, correctly as it turned out, that the town he loved was being bought out from under the people who lived in it. In 1970, alarmed by the developers and speculators he saw circling the place, he ran for sheriff of Pitkin County on the platform he called the Freak Power ticket. His proposals were part serious and part theater. He promised to tear up the paved streets and replace them with sod, to disarm the sheriff's deputies, and to rename the town Fat City, a deliberate move meant to make the name useless as a luxury brand and scare off the investors and second home buyers who wanted a piece of it. He shaved his own head so he could call his crew-cut Republican opponent my long-haired opponent. He lost the election, but only narrowly, close enough that the establishment was frightened by how many people had voted for a man running on a promise to make Aspen unmarketable. The forces he was fighting won that year and kept winning for the next 50 years. When Thompson died in 2005, his ashes were fired from a cannon mounted inside a 15-story sculpture of a clenched fist over his farm, while Johnny Depp and Bill Murray watched the fireworks light up the canyon. He had spent his life trying to keep Aspen weird and cheap, and the town that buried him with that much spectacle had already become the opposite of everything he wanted it to be. Skiing kept expanding through the 1960s and 70s. Buttermilk and Aspen Highlands opened, Snowmass followed, and the four mountains together turned the valley into one of the premier ski destinations on Earth. The X Games arrived at Buttermilk in 2002 and brought 125,000 spectators and a global television audience every January, cementing Aspen's name for a younger generation that had never heard of Jerome Wheeler or the Smuggler Mine. But the same fame that filled the slopes was doing something slower and more permanent to the town itself. Every wave of wealthy visitors who fell in love with Aspen wanted a piece of it, and a mountain valley has only so many pieces to give. Land that had been cheap in Papke's day became expensive, then absurd, then something with almost no relationship to ordinary money at all. The celebrities bought homes. Then the merely rich bought homes. Then the ultra-rich began buying homes as trophies, and the price of simply existing in Aspen started climbing toward the sky and never came back down. The numbers from the modern market read like misprints. By 2025, the median price of a single-family home in Aspen had reached $17.5 million, up nearly a third in a single year. Sales of homes priced above $20 million made up 40% of the market, and those ultra-luxury deals accounted for 87% of every dollar spent on residential real estate in the town. In one recent year, combined home sales across Aspen and neighboring Snowmass Village topped $3 billion. The single biggest sale in Aspen closed at just over $58 million for one house, which worked out to more than $7,000 per square foot. Pitkin County, the county that a Ute removal governor gave his name to, now has the second most expensive housing of any county in the United States. A week-long vacation for a single traveler averages more than $5,000. The town that a Chicago industrialist rescued for pocket change 80 years ago has become a place where the entry fee to belong is measured in the tens of millions. That kind of wealth changes what a town is for, and it changes who gets to live in it. The people who actually run Aspen day to day, the cooks and servers and lift operators, the teachers and nurses and police officers, earn ordinary wages in a place with the least ordinary real estate in the country. For most of them, living within an hour's drive of their jobs is impossible on the open market. Many end up commuting from the Salt, Carbondale, or Glenwood Springs, further and further down the Roaring Fork Valley, chasing the point where a paycheck and a rent check can still be made to meet. Aspen figured this problem out earlier than most resort towns and tried to build a fix. In 1982, it created the Aspen-Pitkin County Housing Authority, one of the first workforce housing agencies in the country, which now manages some 3,100 deed-restricted units meant to keep essential workers somewhere near the town they serve. The city funds a chunk of it through a 1.5% real estate transfer tax that pulled in around $24 million in a recent year, with roughly two-thirds of that money going straight into housing. It helps, and it is nowhere near enough. Restaurant owners in the valley have taken to buying or leasing housing themselves and renting it to their own staff, effectively becoming landlords to keep their kitchens open, because workers who cannot find a place to sleep simply stop showing up. The free market, left alone, would empty Aspen of everyone who makes it function and leave only the owners of second homes that sit dark most of the year. There is a strange echo running through all of this, from the Ute who were removed so the miners could have the valley, to the miners who fled when the silver died, to the ski bums and artists and gonzo journalists who made Aspen cool and then watched that coolness price them out, one lease at a time. Each version of Aspen has been built by people who could not afford to stay in the version that came after. The Nooch lost the valley to the prospectors. The prospectors lost it to the crash. The characters who gave the reborn town its soul, the Friedel Pfeiffers and Hunter Thompsons, lost it to the balance sheet. Thompson saw the pattern coming in 1970 and tried to vote his way out of it, and the vote went the other way. What he was really running against was not a particular developer, but the logic of the place itself, the way a beautiful, finite valley, once it becomes desirable enough, inevitably sorts its people by wealth until only the wealthiest are left. So when people say nobody wants to visit Aspen anymore, they do not mean the town is empty. The slopes are full, the X Games still draw their crowds, and the private jets still stack up at the county airport through the holidays. What they mean is that Aspen has priced out the middle almost entirely, that the ordinary traveler who once could have saved up for a week on the mountain now finds a town with $5,000 vacations and few cheap rooms and fewer cheap meals, a place that has, by design or by drift, made itself for the very rich and almost no one else. The charming ski town became an ultra-exclusive retreat, and the exclusivity is the point. The same instinct that fired Hunter Thompson's ashes out of a cannon, and the same silver that came out of the smuggler too late to matter, Both belong to a town that has never once done anything by halves. Aspen boomed on silver and died. It boomed on skiing and culture and lived. And somewhere in the second boom, in a way almost nobody chose on purpose, it turned into a monument to the very thing its wildest residents spent their lives fighting. The mountains have not changed. The same peaks the Paranaque hunted, the same slopes that buried Independence, the same veins that made and unmade Jerome Wheeler are all still there, indifferent to who owns the valley floor this century. What changed is us, and what we decided the beautiful place is for. The Ute called these the Shining Mountains, and they are still shining over a town that has become, after 150 years of boom and bust and boom, a place most of the people who love it can only afford to look at from the pass. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. It really does mean a lot to me. If you enjoyed this one, I've got another video up on the screen right now that I think you'll like just as much. And if you wouldn't mind hitting that subscribe button, it would really help me out. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I don't see a single cent of ad revenue until I get there. So every single sub makes a real difference.